In 1991, the United States and Philippine governments were in the midst of tense negotiations over extending leases for U.S. military facilities on the islands, especially the two largest and oldest, Clark Air Base and U.S. Navy Base Subic Bay. It was a difficult time for the U.S. military in the Philippines, and an extension of the leases was far from guaranteed. But then the ground started to rumble, and the military realized that they had bigger problems. Operation Fiery Vigil, the 1991 emergency evacuation of nearly 20,000 U.S. military personnel and dependents in the face of the largest volcanic eruption in living memory, deserves to be remembered. Colonel Dick Anderegg, Vice Commander of the U.S. 3rd Tactical Fighter Wing, explained in his account of the extraordinary events of the summer of 1991 that the people of Clark Air Base had faced difficult times as the last decade of the 20th century began. In May of 1990, members of the New People's Army, a communist group that, among other things, opposed the U.S. presence in the Philippines, killed two U.S. airmen wearing civilian clothes at a hotel a half mile from the base's main gate. This not only created fear and tension among the U.S. personnel, but as a precaution, Major General William A. Studer, commander of the 13th Air Force, ordered Americans confined to the base, or if they lived off base, to their quarters. The following July, a significant earthquake struck Luzon. While it did little damage to the base personnel were involved in rescue operations. The damage was significant. More than 1,600 people were killed and more than 100,000 displaced. Anderegg writes, Clark airmen were heroic in their relief efforts, although the horror of dragging mangled bodies from crumpled buildings took its toll. In the fall, some 22,000 civilian employees of U.S. military bases in the Philippines went on strike, and the threat of violence again compelled Studer to confine people to base. And there were more concerns. The island nation faced several attempted coups against the government, two in 1990 alone. With a difficult typhoon season, Super Typhoon Mike did nearly $2 billion in damage in the Philippines. In January, a bomb plot by the Iraqi government against an American cultural center near the capital was foiled. Anderegg writes, in a display of unmistakable gallows humor, many wore T-shirts which proclaimed in bold letters, I survived. Amidst all this was the base lease negotiation. The current agreement was set to expire in 1991, and the negotiations for an extension were, Anderegg writes, bitter and contentious. There were many reasons for the impasse on both sides, but in May, the Washington Post wire service declared that the negotiations were on the verge of collapse. The sticking point was the amount of aid that the U.S. would pay to the Philippines in exchange, and the two sides were far apart. But even if the two sides eventually reach an agreement on the treaty, the service reported, legislators here say that would be virtually no chance of obtaining required approval by the Philippine Senate. It was a stunning development. The U.S. had maintained a military presence in the Philippines since the 19th century. U.S. naval station Subic Bay had been built by the Spanish, had been occupied by the United States Navy with the exception of the period of the Japanese occupation of the islands during the Second World War, since 1899. Clark Air Base had been established in 1903 as a U.S. cavalry encampment. The base was described as sprawling, and its height had a permanent population of 15,000, had places for shopping, golf courses, and even a zoo. The base had recently had a construction boom, and Anderegg notes that $150 million in construction contracts were awarded in 1991. But despite everything that the people of Clark, its personnel, their families, and the civilian employees, many of whom Anderegg notes worked their entire adult lives at Clark, had already survived, there was a much larger problem that had gone mostly unnoticed. Clark Air Base was less than 9 miles from an unassuming, less than 6,000-foot peak called Mount Pinatubo. Anderegg writes, one beautiful morning in early April, base residents could see a tall, puffy white plume rising 1,000 feet into the bright blue sky over the Zambales Mountains. At a routine briefing the next day, an officer reported that the plume had come from a volcano, prompting Anderegg to respond, Volcano? What volcano? He writes it was April 2nd, and the next 10 weeks would prove it to be no belated April Fool's joke. Still, the risk was not well understood. Anderegg writes, during the middle weeks of April, most base residents took some time to peer curiously at the column of steam rising out of the Zambales west of the base. The best view was from the parade field, where the column seemed to rise out of the 13th Air Force headquarters, flanked by the U.S. and Philippine flags. It was the dry season, during the northeast monsoon, so the skies were perfectly blue, and the columns of steam that rose against them were startlingly white and quite majestic. Still, base officials were able to persuade the U.S. Agency for International Development to allocate a small sum, $20,000 for a team of scientists, including the U.S. Geological Survey, to come monitor the situation. After some weeks of study, the team's conclusion was disturbing. Enderig writes, as the data grew, Dr. Christopher Newhall was able to express his evaluation of Pinatubo. The news was not good. It appeared as though it was not a hydrothermal event, one that merely boils subsurface water and throws it into the air as harmless steam like Old Faithful. Nor was it a lava producing volcano similar to those people ooh and ah over in Hawaii, where the lava flows in majestic ribbons. As Rick Hoblit said, Pinatubo was not the kind where you sit on your front porch, sip a cocktail, and wonder if it'll get to your property within the next 4 generations. No. Pinatubo was turning out to be a Plinian, or explosive, volcano. While the U.S. public still had not heard the name Pinatubo, the Air Force started to grasp the reality of the situation. On May 20th, Enderig notes base officials started creating emergency contingency plans in case the need arose to evacuate the base. The danger was real. While no one could yet say what the mountain would do, Clark could certainly be in its crosshairs. The base was literally built on the remains of volcanic tephra from one of Pinatubo's long ago eruptions. After discussing options, the team realized that the most practical plan would be to evacuate base personnel, dependents, and civilian employees of one of the United States' largest overseas bases, some 50 miles to the naval station at Subic Bay. Some 25 miles from Pinatubo, Subic Bay was considered to be far enough away to be safe. Its facilities would be stretched, but the evacuation was assumed to be only a temporary measure. It was a tall order. The only practical way to move so many people was to have them take their own vehicles. The drive would normally take an hour, but the volume of traffic would far exceed the road capacity. Planners had to consider complications, such as the dozens of women who would be in their third trimester of pregnancy. Communication and logistics were complex. Meanwhile, the base population was still in the dark. Enderig writes, even while Clark's leaders agonized over scenario after scenario, the daily routines continued for the general population. High school seniors looked forward to their graduation from Wagner High School. In the evening, whole families strolled under the giant acacias around the parade field. Some stopped for an ice cream cone. In a sign of Air Force humor, the Officers Club planned a Last Days of Pompeii party for Father's Day. They wouldn't make it that long. Despite the planning, when the volcano became more active at the beginning of June, Enderig writes, Clark commanders were caught flat-footed by the sudden increase in volcanic activity. The base was not prepared for an evacuation. No real plan had been revealed to the base populace, and Subic Bay was not prepared to accept 15,000 visitors in one gulp. On the 4th, the scientific team briefed Subic Bay's commander, Rear Admiral Thomas Mercer. The Naval History and Heritage Command writes, Rear Admiral Mercer returned to Subic Bay and began planning to host the entire Clark population of 16,000. Subic Bay housing was already filled to capacity, and the possibility of more than doubling the population left very few options. The decision to evacuate came after 11 p.m. on June 9th, when the scientific team concluded that all signs were that a major eruption would occur in the next 24 hours, although an Air Force spokesman said rather laconically that the evacuation was due to a slight increase of volcanic activity. The evacuation was to begin the next morning at 6 a.m. The Associated Press reported the U.S. military today ordered thousands of Americans to evacuate Clark Air Base after a volcano dormant for 600 years spewed hot ash and rocks. The Naval Institute Press writes that Air Force personnel and their families, except for a few hundred security personnel who remained behind, made the 4 to 5 hour bumper-to-bumper trip through the mountains. The LA Times reported that as convoys of cars began leaving Clark, drivers handed the guards file cards with the names and social security numbers of those departing. While the Times reported that a spokesman for Subic Bay said evacuees would be housed in quarters normally used by crews of visiting warships, it was not at all that easy. In fact, those quarters were already 99.5% occupied. The Naval Institute Press writes that Navy and Marine Corps families shared their small base homes with 2 and 3 Air Force families. Other evacuees slept on mattresses in the 2 base chapels, the daycare center, school classrooms, and any corner that could fit a temporary bed. Accommodations were not luxurious, but almost the entire Department of Defense population in the Philippines was out of danger. While the Philippines was already evacuating civilians from the vicinity of the volcano, not everyone was convinced. The Naval Institute Press writes that some Philippines politicians and media criticized the decision to evacuate, saying that it was politically, not safety, motivated, based on an attempt by the United States to obtain an advantage in upcoming base extension negotiations. But it wouldn't take long for them to see proof for themselves. On June 13th, wire services reported 3 major new eruptions rocked Mount Pinatubo late last night and early today. The service quoted Raimundo Punimbayan, director of the Philippine Institute of Volcanology and Seismology. What we are seeing now are phenomenal eruptions. In fact, it was the largest volcanic eruption since 1912. The ash column was 12 miles high. Andreg wrote, in the same instant was terrifying and awesome. The column continued to climb at an astonishing rate. It looked very much like the movies of nuclear test explosions, a huge mushroom-shaped cloud. The people still at Clark, a small force of scientists, security, and essential personnel, realized that it was time to go. Andreg writes, I looked up over my building, and everybody who was there in that area was racing for a car. There wasn't anybody taking their time. The evacuation process had been difficult for everyone, but it had been the right thing to do. The proof was there for all to see, an enormous tower of ugly gray ash hanging over the base. But Subic Bay was already a mess. Andreg writes, whatever plans Subic Bay had soon foundered under the relentless waves of Clark refugees streaming onto the small bases. On the 13th, the Naval Institute Press writes, overcrowding at Subic Bay was severely straining the water and food supply and other base services, prompting a decision to evacuate all Air Force dependent personnel to the United States. The decision was fortunate. The USS Midway Museum writes, an evacuation task force was swiftly assembled, including the nuclear aircraft carrier Abraham Lincoln, the amphibious assault ship Peleliu, and the Midway. The Naval Institute Press writes, no one knew it at the time, but the quick decision was a major safety measure. It allowed the Navy to steam fleet assets to Subic Bay a full 24 hours before the eruption caused the loss of all support services there. Because the worst was yet to come. The ash started falling the next day. It was a worst-case scenario. The volcano was spewing ash right as a typhoon was hitting. The Naval Institute Press writes one volcanologist said it was a 10 million to 1 shot that a volcano would erupt after lying dormant for more than 600 years and couple with a typhoon. The destructive combination briefly and radically shifted the predicted winds, causing destructive forces that no one could have predicted. The ash was so bad that Saturday the 16th was called Black Saturday. The Naval Institute Press writes, the base had no electric power, no water, no working sanitary facilities, no emergency room capability, no refrigeration capability, impassable roads, and collapsing roofs weighed down by wet ash. There was no option but to reduce the population as quickly and safely as possible. Operation Fiery Vigil had to accelerate. The destroyer tender USS Cape Cod arrived and was able to supply power and water. Then the fleet started to arrive. Eventually, 17 ships of the U.S. 7th Fleet, including the Navy's oldest and newest aircraft carriers, the USS Midway and the USS Abraham Lincoln, and the World War II vintage submarine tender USS Proteus, participated in the operation to take the Americans home, Operation Fiery Vigil. The USS Midway Museum writes, since the Midway housed an all-male crew, feminine, infant, and pet needs had to be addressed. So Jim sent his purchasers to the Navy Exchange with open purchase vouchers, essentially blank checks, to find the goods. After a day and a half of effort, the supplies were loaded and the ship set out for the distressed Philippines. The Naval Institute Press writes that warships had been quickly converted to cruise ships. Sailors gave up their racks for the evacuees. Ships' menus changed to hot dogs and potato chips for the children. First-class lounges became playrooms. Cartoons played continuously over the ship's televisions. A baby was born on the Abraham Lincoln. The mother named him Abraham. In less than 10 days, roughly 20,000 people were transported 250 miles away to the island of Cebu, where they were evacuated by air to Guam, and then the United States. One Air Force dependent and one Filipino civilian employee died when the roof of one of the buildings at Subic Bay collapsed under the weight of the volcanic ash. In fact, both bases were significantly damaged. More than 100 buildings were damaged at Clark Air Base, damage so extensive that estimates to return the base to operating condition exceeded $500 million. Overall, 847 people died in the eruption of Mount Pinatubo, but timely evacuations by the Filipino government likely saved thousands. The United States provided significant humanitarian aid also in the face of the tragedy. Most of those evacuated never returned. The following September, the Philippine Senate voted 12-11 not to renew the U.S. leases, and the U.S. gave up its permanent military presence in the Philippines, although agreements since have returned some U.S. military presence to the islands. The emergency evacuation of nearly 20,000 military personnel and dependents in the face of a volcanic eruption that was 10 times the size of the eruption of Mount St. Helens was an extraordinary feat that required significant effort by both the Air Force and the Navy under difficult conditions, by people that Colonel Anderegg called Ash Warriors. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.